Hello and welcome to As We May Think. This is going to be the start of a new series of videos, but it's not actually going to be a new kind of video for me. I've done quite a few videos that I consider to be fundamental things that every developer should know. I talked about things like ES6, map and set, and I talked about how to get a domain and how to get a hosting for your web app. That stuff I consider to be essential. I also consider this to be essential because I believe that the future of web development is based around the component, and specifically not React, Vue, or Angular, but web components. And those may, in the end, look a lot like React, Vue, or Angular, but that generalized idea of web components is really wonderful, and I want to talk about it. But before I get started on that, the very first thing you're going to see me do is I'm going to install Storybook. Storybook is a tool, not an IDE, but a tool kind of like unit testing, which is designed around the idea of I can create a whole series of stories, each one of which represents kind of a scenario, very much like unit testing. And each scenario includes all of the information you need to set up perhaps a component, and a whole series of attributes on that component being fed in, and how you get to see how it reacts. And you can have several different ones which represent different states of the component. For example, a login component that might appear in the upper right-hand corner on your website might have one state where the user is not yet authenticated, and it's got a spot for a username and a password and a login button or a sign-in button. And then after they're authenticated, it might just show a link to the user's name, and that would carry them through to the profile page, and a logout button. So that would be the alternate state for that particular control. And you could have two different stories for those two different states and look at them and interact with them as well. So that's a lot of what Storybook offers to you. It was originally for React only, but now it supports all sorts of different component architectures, but also it supports straight up HTML, and that's actually what we're going to do here. Is we're going to make use of the instructions that they have here for Storybook with HTML. We're going to make one little nuanced change to this because we want Babel to not transpile our code to ES5. We're going to leave it as ES6. That'll come in handy when we are building our components. So let's go ahead and get started on this. Let's come over here. I've got a copy of Visual Studio running, and let's see, I'll go ahead and nuke everything in this directory so that we're starting from scratch. All right, so this is a fresh from scratch directory, and we're going to use the first command from the Storybook, which is npx -p Okay, so that's going to get us started on the installation process for Storybook itself. Let me talk a little bit about Storybook beyond what I already mentioned. As I said, it's not an IDE in that it's meant to be paired with an IDE of some sort that you're used to running. So whatever editor you're used to using for building your code and running it, you still need that. Not so much the building portion of it. It handles that itself, but you do need all the editing portions of that to work on the various bits and pieces of your stories and the components that you're going to use. And in fact, Storybook is intended to be embedded within another project if you need to. So it can be just something that sits inside your project. You can use it to try out your components and develop them, but it won't interfere with the other things that you're doing. You can just add this into it. It's pretty nifty. The installation, as you can see, can take a minute here. So this is going to take just a little bit. But while we're waiting for that, we're going to go ahead and add a file here, which is our Babel RC. Okay, is it going to let me do that? And the reason we want this, and I've gone ahead and I've used a snippet. If you recall back from or if you even watched a previous video I did where I was doing some live coding, you would have seen me use some snippets for Visual Studio Code that got me several things. This is a new snippet that I've added just for the Storybook Babel RC. This basically says, don't target ES5, target ES6 with all the code, leave it as it is. So if I write a class, you leave it as a class. That's important for some of the other stuff. We'll talk about it in a little bit. But this is fairly important. This file must be added. Looks like the Storybook installation is completed. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to say, just like it shows on the screen there, we're going to run npm run Storybook. Takes a second to build the example code that they provide, which is just a handful of stories and a little bit of material to run. And here we are. So this is their demo group of stories. The first story is this one, and then they've got a button. Okay, very simple, very straightforward. We can build on that. So what we're going to do is we're going to open up the stories directory, and you'll notice that there is one stories file here. It has 2 stories in it right now. We're going to add to that. We're going to say add. We're going to make this example element. That's going to be the name of the story itself. But also, you'll see it in what we're just about to write to. So we're going to have example element. Name equals, we'll go with world. It's cliche, but it works. And then a closing tag. All right, so this is an example. If this actually existed, which it doesn't yet, this is a new custom element, a component, if you will, named example element. One thing to note here is that the name of a custom element or any kind of web component must have a hyphen in it. There's a reason for that. People who are working on HTML obviously don't want to have new things that they add collide with all the stuff we're likely to add using custom elements. So they enforced a rule that said all of our custom elements must have a dash in the name. So it's fine if we collide with each other. So you might want to be a little bit careful in your naming convention so you don't collide with other people's and off-the-shelf components you might add to your application. But they wanted to make sure that they could continue to add new elements and not worry about colliding with what we write. So if we save this, you should immediately see, notice that Webpack rebuilt the app. And here we are, and here is example element. Now, of course, it does nothing at the moment because there isn't an actual component named example element. So let's build that and then hook the two together. So let's go ahead over here to, there's not actually a directory, so let me add a directory here. We'll call it app, like I used when I did my other examples. And we will add a subdirectory for the JavaScript. Whoops. Looks like I missed that. Let's try that again. There we go. Good job. All right, now then, let's add example element dot component JS. All right. So now at this point, we are ready to build our very first web component as far as browsers, modern browsers. Basically, every browser you're likely to run against, unless it's IE 11, has full support for this already. And I'm talking even the ones that are in your phones. If you have an Android phone, your Chrome browser has full support for this. If you have an iOS device, your Safari browser and all the other browsers on your phone, which are all based on Safari, also have full support for this. So let's go ahead and create one. It's a class, and we can call it example element, and it extends HTML element. And it is possible to extend other elements, but the normal web component just extends HTML element. And then from there, we're going to go with custom elements. All right, here's where we actually name. Here's what the element will appear like, looking like when you actually look at HTML. All right, at this point, technically, we are complete. This is a complete custom element. It doesn't do anything, so it's pretty much useless, but this is a set of instructions that says, here's a class. Every time, hey browser, every time you see something that's an element named example element in your HTML, create an instance of this class and tie the two together. That's it. That's what it does. So if we save that, it should rebuild. Actually, it doesn't rebuild because we're not importing it yet. So let's go ahead and pull that in so the two are actually tied together. So we'll do an import of app.js example element. Now if we save, we have built. All right, so at this point, still nothing happens because the component itself, as we observed, is not actually doing anything yet. Let's go ahead and fix that by giving it some code to actually do something. So let's come in here and go. There is several functions that are available, and the minimum one you pretty much need is connected callback. Connected callback gets called every time the browser says, I'm going to create one of these. It creates an instance of the class, and then it calls the connected callback for it to do whatever it's going to do to connect this class to this element. For example, initial rendering. So we'll actually do some initial rendering here. What we'll do is we'll get the name, which you saw me refer to earlier, and we'll say this.getAttribute. Now, the interesting thing about this in this case is the class that's been created, when I put one of these in the HTML, it creates one of these for every single time it appears in the code. And for each one, this points to that particular example. So if there were 6 instances of the same example element, but each one had a different name, when each one referred to this.getAttribute of name, that would be the attribute for that particular instance. So you can have as many of these as you want, and connected callback is able to easily tell them apart because this always refers to a specific one. So then what we'll do is this.inner HTML equals, and we'll just make a string up. So what we'll do is we'll say, let's do this. Let's do bold, and we'll go with hello $name. All right. So if you haven't used template strings before in your ES6 code, basically it's just a templating mechanism built into JavaScript these days. You use backticks, and then within backticks you can make reference to variables, and it will insert them at that particular spot. Now if we save, now if we go back, sure enough, there's hello world. It's bolded, and it appears there in the body of the story. So far, so good. We have written a minimal, and as you see, this is really minimal, 9 lines with a couple of blank lines in there, minimal web component, and it works. Let's go take this one step further. Let's to compare and contrast, because we're not going to go in depth on all the different kinds of web components in this particular video. What I wanted to do was set up Storybook and then actually build a basic web component and another basic web component that actually makes use of the lit element library to make things a little bit easier and show you how different kinds of web components can all sit happily together in the same Storybook. So I'm going to break this for just a moment, and we're going to do an npm install of lit element. Lit element is simply a library to make writing web components easier, because web components by themselves, well, a minimal like this one is trivial to write. There's nothing to it. But a real one, a sophisticated ones, the kind that you're going to see in the very next video, where I go over web components with vanilla JS in a lot more detail, they can be really complicated to write. They can very easily get to the point where you find yourself writing a whole library yourself just to make doing the code easier. But rather than do that, I'm going to recommend after you watch that video and you get a better sense of how web components work, that you combine web components with a library to make it easier, because there's some really cool stuff to be gotten from some of the libraries that are out there. So now we installed lit elements. So let's run Storybook again. Nothing will have changed. So after this build, we're still at exactly the same spot we were at before, other than it opened a new tab. Let's go back over here and let's create another JavaScript component. So we're going to do a new file again. We'll do simple greeting. Now, if you watch one of my videos from last week, you would have seen me do some live coding type things where I was working on a new app. And when I was doing that, I used a Visual Studio snippet, Visual Studio Code snippet called lit, and I'm going to do that again. It's the same one. And what it does is it says, okay, here's a bare, not a bare minimum lit element, but a pretty minimal one that just gives you a good example. So we're going to call this one simple greeting. All right, so now we've created that. It's down here. If you'll notice, it's updated the class name, and we're going to just simply update what it's looking for in the code. All right, now, at that point, we have a complete web component using the lit element library to make the development a little bit easier. This gives us some additional abilities. I'm not going to go into too much detail. Besides, it'll make a lot more sense after you watch the next video, which is specific to web components with Vanilla.js. Then you'll really appreciate some of what's being offered to you here by lit element much more. It'll make a lot more sense. So let's go back and let's make a story that makes use of this new component I just added. So we're going to call this one simple example. No, sorry, simple greeting. Let's call the example the same thing as the component itself. And we will do much the same thing you saw previously, except in this case, we will just be making use of a different component name. Okay, there we go. We've created it. Another example. This is a little snippet that is making use of a new component. Of course, just like before, we must make sure that that one's imported or else it's not going to get used. So if we save right now and come over here, the new example is here, but it's not actually doing anything yet. Let's come in here. You know what? Let's also go ahead and get rid of these two examples. We don't really need those. Let's just cut this to only the ones we're interested in. And we will call this web components. All right, import. All right, there we go. We have now imported both of the two components, and if we come back over here, cross your fingers, there, it works perfectly. There's a difference in this one because I actually used the styling within the component. This is also making use of what is known as shadow DOM. That is something that comes with web components. It is a big deal. If you have ever tried to build web components with other technologies, you know that trying to create classes that work only inside the component and don't leak into the page, or vice versa, classes on the page that do not leak into the component, that can be difficult. So here you're seeing that this is just simply trying to set all paragraphs to red. So if we come to our example, the story in this case, let's go ahead and let's make this, first of all, we use the backticks. It'll make it easier for us to do our formatting. All right, now with the backticks in place, let's go ahead and make this a two-liner. And what we'll do is we will put a paragraph in there. And notice I'm not red. All right, save that, and immediately come back over here. And that paragraph is not red, despite the fact that the component set paragraph to red. With the shadow DOM on by default, the styling inside this component did not leak out into the page. And in fact, we'll go further and we'll come in here and we'll add a style block up here. And we'll say paragraph, color blue. Oops. All right, now if we save that, notice the styling here above the component did not leak into the component. The styling in the component did not leak into the page. The page is now blue. The component stayed red. That's something that Shadow DOM offers you. It works really well. You can set styling at the component level or inside the component. You can do all kinds of fun stuff there. It's very sophisticated, and because it's supported at the browser level, it works really, really well. This is most of what I wanted to show you. I'm going to go a little bit further, and before we end for today, I want to discuss one additional add-on for Storybook. Storybook has a variety of add-ons, but the one in particular that I'm interested in is called Knobs. If it were me who had designed Storybook, I think I probably would have put Knobs in as a default part of Storybook itself, but they have it as an add-on. So we're going to have to add it after the fact. So what we'll do is we will do npm install Storybook add-on -knobs. Actually, we don't need to do save dev. Actually, technically, we did need to do save dev. That mistake won't be replicated, fortunately, in the source code for this particular session and the next couple of sessions, which is already available. There's going to be a link below to a repo, which includes this code for the Storybook, as well as examples I'm going to be going over in the next one, which are all based on vanilla JavaScript, and then another set, which is just like the same components, except they are rewritten using lit element. That'll make the third video in this particular series. All right, now we've got the knobs installed. Let's come back over here to the config.js and let's add the add-on that we need. Oh, sorry, actually, we need a separate add-on file. I said that wrong. Let's go back. We need an add-on .js. Okay, so now we will import at Storybook add-on knobs /register. Alrighty. Now then, with that in place, let's go start up Storybook again. What I've done is I've added an additional add-on to Storybook. That Storybook add-on is called Knobs. What does Knobs do? Well, obviously, I can interact with my different components I've got here. If they had buttons in them or form fields or something I could draw on, any of those kinds of things, I could simply interact with it here in the story. But if I have things that are being passed in via an attribute, for example, like when I instantiated both of these two, I put something in the name field. Well, I can add a knob down here called name and put the text in that I want to appear there, and then I can come down in here and I can change what those attributes and properties look like from down in here and feed those into the Storybook, and I can see how my component is going to react to changed attributes or changed properties. So let's do that real quick. Now we do have to do another import here real quick. Import and text. All right. Now, Knobs is probably literally the worst name that anybody could have ever come up with for this add-on, but it is what it is. So now we're going to add a decorator. And that is going to be with knobs. All right. Now then, we are ready to be able to use the knobs decorator in our example stories. So we're going to demonstrate that here by making this not be a single returned chunk of HTML, but an actual function. So let's make this into an actual function, and then this can just be part of it. So if we come in here, all right, now we are returning a string from a component. Now, fundamentally, this is now still exactly the same as it was a moment ago, but we're going to change it. What we're going to do is we're going to make use of that knob thing. So we're going to say const name equals text name everyone. So how did this change? Basically, what I'm saying is I have a text knob called name. It'll appear with a label called name in the list of knobs, and here's its initial value. Now we're going to come down in here, and we're going to actually replace this with a reference to the name value, which is what's going to come out of that function above. See how I'm getting the name right here? I'm going to put that in here. So we'll save that, it'll rebuild, and we'll come back over here. Sure enough, I now have a knob named name with everyone as its current value. So I can change this, and I can say all as we may think listeners. Hello, all as we may think listeners. Thank you so much for watching today. I hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget, all of the source for this particular video and the two upcoming ones is already in the repo, which will be linked below on GitHub. I hope you enjoyed this. Please like and subscribe and tell all your friends to come listen. Have a great day. Thank you. Bye-bye.